On a Saturday afternoon in July 2025, more than 320,000 people occupied a strip of sand where roughly 6,900 people are counted as year-round residents, 46 visitors for every resident, 8 million trips a year, funneled onto 10 miles of beach, staffed by a seasonal workforce the town cannot itself house. For a century and a half, the arithmetic held. More rooms built, more revenue paid for more roads brought more rooms. Then, in the first half of 2026, hotel receipts fell by nearly a quarter in a single month. Bus fares slipped behind them, and parking revenue dropped further still. A festival that had run for years without incident was quietly canceled. None of it followed a hurricane, a recession, or any single decision a resident could point to and blame. This is the story of a resort engineered around one peak weekend a year, and what starts to give when that weekend can no longer be counted on. Chapter 1. The Inlet. Before it had a name, it was simply the Strip, a barrier island of sand and scrub pine running roughly 10 miles between the Atlantic Ocean and Sinapooksant Bay, unincorporated, unmapped in any way that mattered to the men who used it. Fishermen worked pound nets off its ocean side. Hunters worked the marsh grass and eelgrass flats of the bayside, chasing black duck and Canada geese through blinds built of reed and driftwood. It had no church, and schooling was whatever a family managed on its own. The one place that sold goods kept no fixed hours, and a wagon could not count on the road once a wet season set in. The island belonged, in the way that unclaimed places belong to whoever is willing to cross to them, to the watermen of Worcester County, and to no one else. Getting there required a boat, or patience, or both. Sinapooksant Bay separated the island from the mainland by a shallow, wind-driven stretch of water that froze thin in winter and shoaled in summer, and the crossing depended on tide, weather, and the goodwill of whoever owned a skiff. There was no inlet connecting the bay to the ocean, not then. The barrier island ran unbroken from the Delaware line south to Chincoteague, a single continuous rampart of sand 50 miles long, with what is now Assateague Island, simply its southern half. Ships bound for the bay's oyster grounds and fish houses had to travel miles out of their way to reach open water. For the watermen who worked the bay, this was not an inconvenience to be tolerated. It was the central fact of their economy, and they had wanted it fixed for years. They had no way to fix it. Cutting a channel through a barrier island by hand, with the tools and money available to a rural eastern shore county in the first decades of the 20th century, was not a plan anyone could finance. Proposals circulated. None were funded. The island kept its unbroken shoreline into the early 1930s, indifferent to what the fishermen downstream of it needed. And then, on August 23, 1933, a hurricane came ashore and did the job for free. The storm, later estimated at Category 4 strength, battered the Delmarva coast for 3 days, driving a storm surge over the low dunes and pushing bay water east against ocean water pushing west, until the island itself gave way. Where the two forces met, the sand simply failed. A channel opened 50 feet wide, 8 feet deep, cutting the barrier island in two at a point a few miles south of the fishing village that would become Ocean City. The rail line running down the peninsula, the same line that had carried the earliest cottage builders and hotel guests to the beach since the 1870s, washed out where the new inlet crossed its bed. What had been one continuous strip of sand from Delaware to Virginia was now two, the resort side to the north and the wilder, unclaimed stretch to the south that would eventually take the name of the channel that had severed it, Assateague. The men who had spent years asking Worcester County and the state of Maryland for money to dig an inlet got their inlet in 3 days, unpermitted and unpaid for, cut by a storm that left the fishing fleet with a permanent sheltered connection between bay and ocean that no engineer had designed and no budget had approved. Boats could now reach the Atlantic without the long detour south. A harbor existed where none had before, one that would later be stabilized with stone jetties the Army Corps of Engineers built to keep the channel from closing the way it had opened, by accident. The fishing and boating economy that would define the town for the decades that followed organized itself around a piece of geography nobody had planned and nobody owned. What the storm had not decided was who would profit from it. Chapter 2. The Founders. 64 years before that hurricane cut the inlet, in 1869, the strip belonged to almost no one in particular. Isaac Coffin was a Worcester County-born farmer who had spent 3 decades working his sandy inland acreage, too thin for tobacco and too far from Baltimore's markets to matter much. He arrived at the beach in 1869, when the shore held fewer than 11 year-round residents, and he did not arrive with a plan so much as an instinct. Sportsmen from Berlin and Snow Hill had been rowing across the bay for years to hunt and fish the strip, sleeping under canvas or not sleeping at all. Coffin built a cottage where they could pay for a bed instead. The building was modest, a farmhouse with extra rooms, nothing that would have drawn a second look inland, but it was the first structure on that 10-mile stretch of sand built explicitly to take a stranger's money in exchange for a night's rest. Word moved the way it did then, by letter and by mouth, from one eastern shore county to the next. Within a few seasons, Coffin was turning away more men than he could bed. He is remembered now, when he is remembered at all, as the grandfather of Ocean City hospitality, not a builder of empires, an actual farmer who noticed a market before anyone had named it a resort. The strip had its first innkeeper. It did not yet have a name investors would recognize. By 1875 it had both. A syndicate of Worcester County men had the beach surveyed that year into 250 individual lots, the first attempt to impose a ledger on what had been scrub pine and dune grass. They incorporated as a company and sold 4,000 shares at $25 apiece. $100,000 raised from Snow Hill lawyers, Berlin merchants, and Baltimore men who had never seen the property they were buying into. The money did not sit long. It went into lumber, into pilings driven through sand, into something firmer, into a structure large enough to justify the whole enterprise. On July 4th, 1875, the Atlantic Hotel opened its doors. 400 rooms faced the ocean, more than the entire resident population of the county seat could have filled twice over, with a billiard room and an entertainment hall built for gentlemen who arrived expecting the comforts of a Baltimore club transplanted onto sand. It was, that summer, the largest building most of its guests had ever slept inside. The hotel did not simply house visitors. It manufactured the idea that this stretch of Barrier Island was a destination rather than a hunting camp, and it did so with a confidence that $100,000 of shareholder money can buy, and nothing less will. Getting to the Atlantic Hotel in 1875 still meant a wagon ride and a boat crossing, and the syndicate understood that comfort without access was a dead investment. In 1878, a rail line pushed east out of Berlin toward the Sinnepuxent Bay, closing the distance between the county's interior towns and the water's edge. By 1881, the track ran straight to the shore itself, depositing passengers within walking distance of the hotel's veranda. The wilderness that had taken Isaac Coffin's guests a full day to reach by rowboat was, within 6 years, a few hours from a train platform. In 1880, between the railroad's arrival at the bay and its extension to the beach, the settlement was formally incorporated as a town. The paperwork mattered less than what it represented. A private retreat built by a syndicate for men who could afford $25 shares and 400-room hotels was being converted by charter, by rail, by simple arithmetic of who could now afford the fare, into something the growing middle class could reach. Coffin's farmhouse and the syndicate's hotel had proven the beach could be sold. What remained was who would arrive next to sell it further, and how much of it they would decide to keep for themselves. Chapter 3. The Trimpers. Daniel Trimper was a German-born hotelier who had spent a decade running boarding houses in Baltimore before the coast pulled him east. He arrived in Ocean City in 1890 with his wife, Margaret, when the town counted fewer than 300 year-round residents, a scatter of guest houses, and a boardwalk still more suggestion than structure. Margaret kept the ledgers. Daniel kept the ambitions. Neither of them had built anything before, and neither of them intended to stop at one hotel, one block, or one generation. What the Coffins and the syndicate had proven, that the beach could be sold, the Trimpers now set out to prove could be sold again, sold bigger, and sold under a family name that would still be printed on a marquee more than a century later. By 1893, they held the deeds to nearly every parcel of boardwalk frontage between South Division and South First Streets, a stretch scarcely 2 blocks long that would become the commercial spine of the resort. On it stood 2 hotels, the Eastern Shore and the Sea Bright Azuri, modest frame buildings built for a clientele that still arrived by rail and left by Sunday. It was not an empire. It was the outline of one, and outlines, on a barrier island with no zoning board and no memory, tend to fill in fast. The storm that struck in 1900 took the Sea Bright apart, the way the coast would keep taking things apart for the next 60 years, without warning, without apology, and without much regard for what had been spent to build them. The Trimpers rebuilt, and rebuilt strangely. A mock Tudor silhouette, modeled, however loosely, on Windsor Castle, its turrets rendered in lath and shingle instead of stone. They called it the Windsor Resort. Underneath the borrowed grandeur, they installed a shooting gallery, a boxing ring, a gambling room that operated with the discretion small towns extend to their largest taxpayers, and a live alligator kept on display for travelers who had never seen one and were willing to pay a nickel to. The castle was a joke the Trimpers were in on. The money it drew was not. 12 years later they went further. In 1912 they purchased a 50-foot carousel from the Herschel Spillman Company of North Tonawanda, New York. Not a carousel, the second one the company had ever built, a distinction that mattered to no one at the time and would matter a great deal later once Herschel Spillman's earlier machines had rotted, burned, or been broken up for parts elsewhere along the coast. The animals were carved by hand: cats, dogs, frogs, roosters, lions, dragons, a menagerie with no evolutionary logic and no need for one. It cost the Trimpers a sum that would have bought a house outright in most inland counties. It is still turning on the boardwalk. Trimpers, the operation that grew up around it, remains America's oldest amusement park, still run by the family that founded it. Not a claim the Trimpers advertised at the time, since at the time there was no way to know it would still be true. What Daniel and Margaret had assembled by 1912 was no longer a hotel or two. It was a machine for converting curiosity into revenue, block by block, ride by ride, season after season, and the machine needed one thing above all else to keep running: crowds, arriving in numbers the boardwalk of 1893 had never been built to hold. They came by the thousands now, by train and later by automobile, drawn by an alligator in a tank and a castle made of shingle and a carousel with dragons on it. Nobody who profited from that crowd stopped to ask what happened when it grew larger than the boardwalk could bear, or when the ocean that had built the island decided, as it periodically did, to take some of it back. That question was still a few decades off. It would not stay off for long. Chapter 4. The Crowds and the Storm. Picture Baltimore Avenue on the night of September 4th, 1960, a Sunday, the boardwalk crowd still thick with the tail end of Labor Day weekend. Word moves through the arcades and the fry stands that a young man has been arrested outside a dance hall, and within the hour something close to 2,500 teenagers have converged on the Ocean City Police Station, filling the street, rocking parked cars, chanting for his release. The department has perhaps a dozen officers on duty. State police are called in from 3 counties. By sunrise, the crowd disperses on its own, the way summer crowds do, and the boy is released without incident, but the arithmetic of the night stays on the books. A town of fewer than 2,000 year-round residents had just discovered that its entire economy depended on an annual invasion it could not fully police, reason with, or turn away. Not a labor problem or a crime wave, but an actual demographic bomb wired into the tax base. Ocean City needed the crowds. It was starting to fear them, too. That fear, it turns out, is misdirected. The threat was never going to come from the boardwalk. It was going to come from the water. The storm arrives without a name, because in March of 1962, the Weather Bureau is not yet naming storms the way it names hurricanes, and this one is not a hurricane at all. It is a nor'easter, a slow, wheeling extratropical low that parks itself off the Delmarva coast on March 5th and does not leave for 36 hours. 5 high tides batter the shoreline instead of the usual 2, each one arriving before the last has finished draining. Imagine standing on the Ocean City boardwalk on the morning of March 7th. If standing there were still possible, the ocean has stopped behaving like an edge and started behaving like a floor. Entire sections of decking tear loose from their pilings, whole, and travel, one slab after another lifted and hurled into the sides of hotels, punching through lobby windows blocks from where the boards were nailed down. Cars vanish under 4 and 5 feet of sand. Houses vanish under more. Route 528 disappears entirely in places, swallowed and redrawn. Maryland's Governor J. Millard Towse tours the wreckage by military vehicle because the roads no longer exist for anything else, and he calls it the worst natural disaster his state has seen in his lifetime. He is not exaggerating for effect. The numbers do not need help. More than 30 people are dead along the mid-Atlantic coast by the time the water recedes. Damage estimates climb past $200 million, a figure that means little until you translate it into what it actually was. Boardwalk, block after block of it, gone. Storefronts gutted to the studs. The Windsor and its neighbors flooded to the second floor. Ocean City takes the brunt of it because Ocean City is a 10-mile sandbar with almost nothing behind it to slow the water down. What the storm does not do, curiously, is kill the town's appetite for growth. It does the opposite. North of town, where the barrier island had always been thinnest and least developed, scrub pine, a scattering of fishing shacks, land nobody serious had bothered to price. The storm strips away whatever illusion of stability those lots still carried. Owners who had been holding out for a better offer now hold flooded foundations and collapsed piers instead, and they sell. Quietly, parcel by parcel, while the rest of the town is still hauling sand out of living rooms and off of coastal highway, men with capital and patience begin buying up North Ocean city lot by cheapened lot. Nobody is watching the deed transfers that spring. Everyone is watching the water. Chapter 5. The Gold Coast. Picture the skyline first, because for 9 years there is none. Ocean City in 1969 is a town of motels and cottages, nothing taller than the boardwalk hotels built before the war, nothing that breaks the horizon the way the new engineering allows. Then in 1970, ground breaks on the High Point condominium, and by the following year it stands finished, the resort's first true high-rise, a single tower announcing what 50 more will eventually confirm. Nobody on the boardwalk in 1971 mistakes it for the last one. It is a test case, and it passes. The infrastructure catches up fast, because infrastructure is what has been missing, not appetite. In 1972, the state completes Route 90, a 4-lane bridge and highway spur that lets traffic bypass the old bottleneck at the Route 50 drawbridge, and the town opens a new sewage treatment plant at 64th Street, an unglamorous fact, a decisive one. Together they do something zoning maps alone never could. They make the north end of the island buildable at scale. Scrub pine and dune grass, 3 miles of it, are now serviceable land. The permits follow within months. By 1975, the proof stands 25 stories over the dune line. The Century Thurs condominium opens that year with 185 units and a claim no other building on the Delmarva coast can make. Tallest structure in Ocean City. Full stop. It will not hold that title forever, but for the moment it is the answer to the question the High Point first raised. Through the rest of the decade, the units keep coming. More than 10,000 condominium units built across the 1970s alone, then another 3,187 between 1981 and 1990, a second wave stacked on the first. And the stretch from 94th Street to 118th Street earns its own name in these years. Condo Row to the people who work there, the Gold Coast to the brochures. Both names describe the same fact from different angles. Money, going vertical, block after block. Picture 118th Street on a clear night in the early 1980s, the towers lit floor by floor. Century 1, its neighbors rising to answer it, balconies stacked 20 and 25 deep, glass catching the last of the sunset over the bayside and holding the boardwalk's glow on the ocean side. Elevators running past midnight, air conditioners humming in a register that never existed here before 1970, parking lots filled with plates from Pennsylvania, from Ohio, from Virginia, engines still ticking as they cool. 20 years earlier, this ground was scrub pine and dune, empty of roads, dark after sunset, claimed by nothing but the storm tide. Now it is the most valuable shoreline in the state of Maryland, and it did not happen by accident. The math underneath the skyline is the part the postcards leave out. By the 1980s, the resort draws close to 8 million visitors a year, against a year-round population holding near 7,000, a ratio of more than 1,000 visitors for every person who actually lives there, and it is not a seasonal anomaly anymore. It is the model. The town has built itself, tower by tower, permit by permit, around the assumption that the crowd arrives, spends, and leaves, and that assumption is now load-bearing. Nobody who sat on the zoning board in 1972 wrote that ratio into an ordinance. It arrived anyway, and it stayed. What nobody has built in all those years of concrete and steel is a mechanism for the nights the crowd decides not to leave on schedule. The resort has learned how to house 1,000-to-1 imbalance. It has not yet been asked whether it can control one. Chapter 6. The siege. The question posed at the close of the previous chapter does not wait long for an answer. It arrives in October of 2020 on a weekend nobody on the town council had sanctioned, under a name the resort had spent years trying to disown, H2O. I began more than a decade earlier as an organized car meet, a legitimate calendar event with permits and a route. By 2014, the town had revoked its sanction, unable to control the volume it drew. The unsanctioned version did not go away. It got larger, angrier, and less interested in permission. What happens over those 3 days is not a disturbance. It is a siege conducted by the town's own economic base. More than 100 arrests, 1,500 citations written across a single weekend for offenses ranging from reckless driving to open containers to assault. Cars run stop signs at speed on coastal highway with crowds pressed against the curb, engines screaming through neighborhoods built for boardwalk foot traffic, not drag strips. Officers wade into the crowd to break up a street takeover and are met with bottles and rocks, thrown from a mass too dense to isolate a suspect from. They answer with pepper spray. Nobody is killed. That fact does the work of a mercy. The police chief afterward does not reach for a euphemism. He calls it the worst year yet, not the worst H2OI, the worst year, full stop, a statement that folds the weekend into a pattern rather than treating it as an aberration. The resort has hosted this crowd in one form or another since the 1960 riot outside its own police station. It has never before had to describe a Saturday night in the vocabulary of crowd control on this scale. 60 years of managed permissiveness produce, in the end, a chief of police speaking like a man documenting a siege for a report nobody wanted to write. The town's response is not proclamation, it is ordinance. Ocean City establishes what it calls a special event zone, a designation that lets it impose fines the standard traffic code cannot. $1,000 for racing, $1,000 for skidding, tacked onto impound fees, running another $1,000 to $1,500 on top. The pricing is not incidental. It is calibrated to outrun a rental car deposit, a weekend's hotel bill, and, in the end, the value of the trip itself. A resort built on the premise that a teenager with a car and a tank of gas constitutes an economy has begun, formally charging that teenager for showing up. There is an irony here the town does not advertise and does not need to. The same youth-driven, car-borne, weekend-migrating crowd that filled the motels in 1960, that once surrounded its own police station demanding a friend's release, is now the crowd the police department budgets against. The customer base and the security threat have never been two different populations. They were always the same one, arriving in different decades wearing different music, and then unnoticed. Somewhere in the accounting behind the arrests and the impound fees, a different set of numbers starts climbing. The cost of holding the sand in place against an ocean that does not observe municipal boundaries, and the cost of finding enough hands every summer willing to come from the other side of the world to do the work the town cannot staff from within 60 miles of itself. Neither figure makes the police blotter. Both will matter more than the citations. Chapter 7. The Bills. Beach replenishment stops being a project and becomes a line item, recurring now the way payroll recurs or debt service recurs, an obligation the town cannot opt out of. In 2021, the Army Corps of Engineers and its partners pump sand back onto the Ocean City shoreline at a cost of $15.7 million, with federal, state, and local governments splitting a combined bill of roughly $21 million, once engineering and administration are added in. The town's own share is modest by comparison. The obligation is not. Ocean City has been replenishing its beach on a rolling cycle since the late 1980s, and by 2021 the practice has stopped looking like maintenance and started looking like rent, paid on schedule to an ocean that does not send invoices but collects all the same. The number the engineers cite to justify the expense is $900 million, the estimated storm damage the replenished beach has prevented since the program began. It is not simply a marketing figure. It is the number that turns a beach from scenery into infrastructure, the same category as a seawall or a levee, the kind of asset that earns no revenue and simply prevents catastrophe, one hurricane season at a time. A town that sells sand to tourists for free must first buy it back from the ocean at a price the tourists never see on the receipt. The receipt goes to the taxpayer instead. By 2026, that receipt grows sharply. A single replenishment project, once priced at $15.7 million, now carries estimates ranging between $27 million and $40 million, not inflation alone, but the compounding cost of holding a barrier island in place against an ocean that was never asked whether it approved of the arrangement. The dunes do not get more valuable. The sand does not get more scarce. Exactly. Equipment, labor, permitting, and the sheer tonnage required to keep the beach at the width the resort's entire economy depends on, all of it climbs together and none of it climbs back down. The other cost from the ledger is not sand, it is hands. Ocean City in the 21st century runs on a workforce it cannot recruit locally, cannot house affordably, and increasingly cannot function without. Nearly 12,000 seasonal jobs open every summer in kitchens, in housekeeping, behind front desks, and roughly 4,000 of them filled by international students on J-1 exchange visas arriving from Eastern Europe, from South America, from countries most of the resort's summer visitors could not locate on a map. Not a convenience or a stopgap, but an actual labor pipeline built into the town's operating model as firmly as the boardwalk itself. The arithmetic underneath it is difficult to say aloud. A resort built to house 300,000 weekend visitors at the height of season struggles every year, to house the thousands of young workers who change the sheets in the rooms those visitors sleep in. The rentals go to tourists first. The workers double and triple up in whatever is left, when anything is left. Two numbers, sand and labor, both rising, both invisible to the visitor standing on the boardwalk with a funnel cake, both filed somewhere behind the tax receipts that make the season look, from a distance, like nothing but success. Not every group of young people gathering on that boardwalk after dark in the summer of 2026 is on a work visa. Some are teenagers with nowhere in particular to be, and a phone and a time and a place shared faster than any curfew can be written. What happens next will not be new. Ocean City has seen a crowd of the young turn ungovernable before, on a night in 1960 nobody in town has fully stopped talking about. The vote still ahead that year, meanwhile, is not about sand or visas or curfews. It is about who gets to sleep in this town at all. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. By July of 2026, the calls to the Ocean City Police Department's non-emergency line describe a pattern the department already has a name for, because the department has lived through it before. 40 teenagers, then 60, then upward of 100, converging on the boardwalk after 11 at night, summoned by nothing more official than a shared location, pinned past phone to phone in the space of 9 minutes, residents start calling them pop-up mobs. Officers privately call them something closer to the language in the old file from 1960. A crowd that assembles faster than a curfew can be posted and scatters faster than a cruiser can reach the corner, then reassembles 4 blocks north before the radio call is even finished. Nobody on the town council has to explain the historical echo. Everyone in the room already hears it. The statistics released that summer are, at first read, damning. Ocean City's overall crime rate, officials report, sits far above the national average, a number that moves through cable segments faster than the caveat beneath it ever does. The caveat is arithmetic, not opinion. A town of roughly 7,000 people who actually sleep there in January does not carry the same denominator as a beach that hosts 10 times that many bodies on a July Saturday. Divide a summer city's incident count by a winter town's census, and the rate will always run high. That is not an excuse offered on the record. It is only the math. The town's appetite for self-correction is tested that same year, and fails by a margin small enough to sting. In August of 2025, after opponents force a special election, voters decide the fate of a referendum meant to limit short-term rentals across more than 4,000 homes, the engine of the very density now filling the boardwalk past midnight. The result? 834 votes against, 800 in favor. 34 votes separate a town that regulates its own market from a town that does not. Just a margin thin enough that a Tuesday commute, a rainstorm, a canceled flight home could have flipped it. No supermajority, no mandate either way. 34 votes is not a landslide against regulation. It is a town evenly split, tipping by accident toward the status quo, toward more homes converted, more turnover, more strangers on the sand every 7 days, and no lawful way yet to slow any of it. The rental owners who fought the measure call it a win for property rights. The residents who lost it call it a preview of a town they no longer recognize on a Saturday in August. Both descriptions are accurate. Neither settles anything, and through the back half of 2025 into 2026, the tourists themselves begin, for the first time in years, to answer with their feet. One tracking report shows visitation falling from roughly 800 to 3,300 to roughly 588,000, a decline officials attribute in public statements to a soaked Memorial Day weekend that kept families off the sand during the opening days that set the tone for the season, and to the cancellation of the Boardwalk Rock Music Festival, a fixture that had reliably filled hotel rooms in a month otherwise thin on reasons to come. Weather passes, festivals get rescheduled. The numbers forgive neither one. They simply record fewer people spending fewer nights in a town built entirely on the opposite assumption. Fewer people came. None of this, on its own, breaks a town that has survived hurricanes and its own reinvention twice already. Fewer visitors means fewer nights booked. Fewer nights booked means less collected at the register. And the register is where the story goes next. The tourism numbers were only ever the leading edge. What came after did not wait long to arrive. Chapter 9, What Remains? By May 2026, the numbers Ocean City had spent a year bracing for arrived on schedule. Hotel revenue for the month came in at $8.8 million, down from $11.6 million the year before, a drop of nearly a quarter. the same fraction promised at the start of this story. Occupancy fell with it, from roughly 63% to roughly 56%, 7 points of rooms that had been full the summer before standing empty instead. The mechanism is not complicated. Fewer bodies on the boardwalk means fewer beds rented, and fewer beds rented means a smaller sum wired into the town's accounts each month. What had been forecast in January arrived on time in May. Memorial Day weekend, the unofficial opening of the season, delivered the sharpest single reading of the year. Bus ridership fell by about 31% against the same weekend in 2025, and bus revenue fell further still, down roughly 35%, since the buses that did run carried fewer riders paying full fare. Parking revenue, the clearest proxy for cars actually arriving, dropped 57%. More than half the money that normally fills the meters and municipal lots along the beach block gone before the weekend was over. Revenue per available room, the industry's measure of a room's true earning power, dropped nearly 25% for the weekend that traditionally sets the tone for the 90 days to follow. 3 transportation systems, 1 lodging market, same contraction, same 72 hours. June brought something closer to a plateau than a recovery. Hotel revenue for the month fell only about 2% year over year, a figure small enough to read briefly as stabilization. Occupancy told a different story, sliding from about 80% to about 73%, even as the revenue line stayed nearly flat, a gap made up by rooms discounted rather than left empty. Short-term rentals, absent from the hotel tally and lightly regulated by comparison, drew off a share of the visitors who once would have booked the boardwalk directly. Feeder markets softened as well. Baltimore, the metro area that has sent Ocean City its weekenders for generations, sent fewer of them. The town's oldest engine was still running. It was running on less fuel than it was built to require. What remains at the end of the accounting is not a column of figures, but a set of objects. The Atlantic Hotel, the resort's founding structure from 1875, is gone entirely, burned and rebuilt and finally leveled decades ago. A few blocks north, near where the old Windsor Resort once stood, Trimper's Carousel still turns beneath the same string lights it has carried for more than a century, painted horses rising and falling to an organ playing what it always has. The Ocean City Inlet still churns at the southern tip of the boardwalk, water moving fast and cold between 2 stone jetties, cut open by accident in the hurricane of 1933 and made permanent afterward by the Army Corps of Engineers. The town's founding disaster is still, a century later, doing exactly what it did on the night it arrived. The beach itself, walked by the hundreds of thousands of visitors counted at the start of this story, is not the original beach at all. It is sand pumped ashore by dredge and pipeline from borrow sites offshore, and replaced every few years at a cost that climbs each time. Condo Row still lights up after dark along the Gold Coast. 25 stories of glass and balconies stacked one against the next for 2 miles of shoreline, built to face an ocean it was never asked to fight. Now the town pays continuously, survey by survey and sand truck by sand truck, to keep that ocean at the distance the buildings were designed to enjoy. Condo Row's lights come on tonight in sequence, floor by floor, the way they do every night regardless of how many of the rooms behind them are occupied. From the inlet jetty, the glow reads as one long pale band against the dark, 25 stories of it, suspended above a beach that will not exist in this form 5 years from now. It is a skyline raised to enjoy an ocean that once handed the town its inlet for free in a single night in 1933, and has been billing it for the upkeep ever since. The tide comes in anyway, the way it always has, indifferent to what it is owed.